Every empire believes it will be the exception. Every system, no matter how sophisticated, no matter how deeply interconnected, eventually reaches a moment where its architects believe they have solved the problem of collapse. They point to their institutions, they cite their agreements, they show you the numbers, and then something small happens, something the analysts dismiss as temporary, as correctable, as a negotiating tactic. And by the time they understand what it was, a fracture point, it is already too late to reverse the trajectory. Visual, black and white archival footage of 1930s factory closures, then cut to modern semiconductor production lines. We are not here to tell you the world is ending. We are here to tell you what the data suggests when you stop reading it in isolation and start reading it the way historians read it after the fact, when the pattern becomes undeniable. Because here is what we know about systemic collapse. It never announces itself. It accumulates, quietly, in layers, until the weight of those layers exceeds what the structure was designed to hold. Part 2. The Tariff Wall. Visual, split screen, cargo ships departing Shanghai on the left, empty American factory floors on the right. By February 2026, the tariff rates between the United States and China had reached levels not seen since the interwar period. 145% on Chinese imports entering the United States, 125% on American goods entering China. Read those numbers slowly, not as a policy debate, not as a negotiating tactic. Read them the way you would read a temperature rising in a patient who insists they are fine. At 45% tariffs, trade becomes expensive. Supply chains adapt. Economists call this adjustment. At 145%, something categorically different happens. Trade stops being trade. It becomes theater. Visual, graph showing US-China bilateral trade volume declining sharply, a line that does not recover. The goods still move, but they route around, through Vietnam, through Mexico, through Malaysia. Factories stamp new country of origin labels onto components that began their journey in Shenzhen. The supply chain bends, finds workarounds, preserves the appearance of function while the underlying logic dissolves. This is what systems do in the early phase of fracture. And here is what history tells us about tariff walls of this magnitude. They are never about the tariffs. The tariff is the symptom. The disease is the collapse of a shared economic vision, the belief that two systems can produce and grow together without one eventually demanding terms the other cannot accept. Visual, archival headlines from 1930, Smoot-Hawley coverage, dissolving into present-day trade policy imagery. In 1930, the United States passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Economists called it a corrective measure, a protection of American industry. Over 1,000 American economists signed a petition warning it would cause catastrophic damage. It was signed anyway. Within 2 years, global trade collapsed by 66%, not because of one tariff wall. Because tariff walls invite reciprocal walls. Reciprocal walls invite retaliation. Retaliation invites isolation. Isolation invites fragmentation. The world does not break all at once. It breaks in layers. Part 3. The Silicon Shield cracks. Visual, aerial footage of an unfinished semiconductor facility in the Arizona desert. Cranes still, construction halted. Then TSMC headquarters in Hsinchu, Taiwan, operational. On February 3rd, 2026, a decision was made in a boardroom that most people would not understand for another decade. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, the single most strategically critical corporation on Earth, announced the suspension of its $14 billion fabrication facility in Arizona. The official explanation cited cost overruns, labor shortages, technical complexity, all true, but none of them were the reason. Visual, animated map, US, Europe, Japan, South Korea, dependency lines converging back on Taiwan. To understand what this decision means, you have to understand what TSMC actually is. TSMC does not merely produce chips. TSMC produces the physical substrate of modern civilization. Every advanced weapon system, every cloud server, every AI training cluster, every encrypted military communication device, all of it flows through a handful of fabrication facilities on one island in the Taiwan Strait. For a decade, the United States had pursued one overriding objective: bring that production onto American soil. The CHIPS Act, the subsidies, the diplomatic pressure, ground broken in Arizona with ceremony, $14 billion committed, and then it stopped. Visual, split image, Roman frontier arms workshops on the left, semiconductor fab clean rooms on the right. Here's the historical parallel that should unsettle you. In the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, the Roman Empire maintained a network of arms workshops, called fabricae, across its frontier provinces. These produced the weapons and equipment that kept the legions functional. As the empire's administrative grip weakened, as taxation became unstable, as political cohesion fractured, these fabricae began falling outside Roman control, one by one. They did not vanish, they continued producing. but they produced for whoever controlled the territory around them. The empire had not lost its weapons technology. It had lost control of the geography where that technology existed. Visual, widening shot, semiconductor chip under magnification, pulling back to reveal global trade routes. TSMC's Arizona facility was not merely a factory. It was meant to be the first concrete proof that the United States could reconstitute its industrial sovereignty, pulling critical production back within its own borders. Its suspension is not a corporate setback. It is a signal that the industrial geography of the 21st century may not be as reconfigurable as its architects believed. Capital, complexity, and expertise do not simply relocate because a government subsidizes the move. Systems accumulate in places for deep historical reasons. Decades of institutional knowledge, supply networks built over generations. They resist relocation for the same reasons. The Romans discovered this, the British discovered this, and now $14 billion in the Arizona desert are discovering it again. Part 4. The dollar's quiet erosion. Visual, currency trading floors. Then cut to maps of BRICS plus nations highlighted across Asia, Africa, and South America. While the tariff wall rose and the silicon shield cracked, something else was happening, more slowly, more quietly, with far more permanent implications. Within the BRICS plus bloc, now encompassing Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the UAE, and an expanding roster of associate members, the share of bilateral trade in local currencies had reached 90%. 90%. Part 5. The architecture of fragmentation. Visual, time-lapse of global shipping route maps. Dense, interconnected lines slowly separating into two distinct clusters. What we are witnessing is not a trade war in the conventional sense. A trade war implies two parties competing within a shared system, fighting over terms within a commonly accepted framework. What is forming now is something categorically different. Two parallel systems, two trade architectures, two monetary frameworks, two technology ecosystems, two visions of what the global order should be and who should organize it. Visual. Maps showing Roman trade network fragmentation, dense in the 2nd century, fragmenting by the 4th, regional by the 5th. The Roman World Trade Network, which at its peak connected silk from China to tin from Britain, spices from India to grain from North Africa, did not collapse because of a single invasion. It fragmented, slowly, over generations. The roads deteriorated because the administrative coherence required to maintain them had eroded. The currency was debased because military costs exceeded what a fracturing economy could generate. As the network fragmented, each region became more self-sufficient. And as self-sufficiency grew, the rationale for maintaining the network diminished. And as the rationale diminished, investment declined. A self-reinforcing spiral, not caused by malice or incompetence, caused by the logic of a system that had exceeded the institutional capacity required to sustain it. Visual, present-day imagery, BRICS summit, U.S. congressional hearings, European industrial policy debates. Today's fragmentation follows a recognizable architecture. The United States builds walls and calls them protection. China builds alternative infrastructure and calls it connectivity. The Global South selects routes that do not lead through Washington. Each decision is locally rational. Each actor responds to incentives within their own strategic calculus, and each decision, in aggregate, accelerates the divergence. The institutions designed to manage this divergence, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, are structurally unable to mediate between systems that no longer share a common interest in the same architecture. This is what the late stage of a shared system looks like before it separates into successor systems. Part 6. The question that remains slow fade through archival footage, fall of Constantinople, dissolution of the British Empire, collapse of Bretton Woods in 1971. So we return to the question, every piece of data, every fractured relationship, every suspended factory, and every local currency agreement has been quietly building toward. Is this an economic crisis? A temporary rupture, painful but correctable, in a system that retains its fundamental architecture? Or is this something older? Something historians recognize not in the moment of its occurrence, but in retrospect, when they trace the full arc and identify where the direction became irreversible. The permanent migration of economic gravity eastward, southward, away from the institutional centers that have organized global production and power for the past 80 years. World map, trade route lines dimming across the North Atlantic, brightening along new corridors across the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. Empires do not announce their decline. They continue to function, their institutions still meeting, their currencies still circulating, their militaries still deployable, long after the structural reality has shifted beneath them. The Roman Senate continued legislating after Rome ceased to be the organizing center of Western power. The British pound remained a reserve currency for decades after Britain ceased to be the world's leading industrial economy. Systems persist on institutional memory, on accumulated trust, on the inertia of a world that has not yet learned to organize itself around a different assumption. What changes first is not the map. What changes first is the behavior. And when 90% of a bloc representing 40% of global GDP stops settling trade in your currency, when the factory meant to anchor your technological sovereignty suspends construction in the desert, when tariff walls rise to levels that make shared production economically irrational, the behavior has already changed. The map simply is not caught up yet. It never does. Not until the transition is complete. Because this is what systems do. They do not end. They transform. And the only question that has ever mattered across every transition and every empire at the edge of its own reconfiguration is not whether the transformation is coming. It is whether you are reading the signals clearly enough to understand what is already underway. Visual. Slow black fade, silence. The event is never the warning. The reaction is